We just don't think that we're going to get to phase 2 or phase 3. We don't believe that we can have a successful donor conference, just as a real example, until people know they want to know who's in charge, and they want to know that there's security. Okay, they want to make sure that who's going to pledge billions of dollars to build things that are going to get blown up again because a war starts. So they want to know who's in charge, and they want to know that there's security, and that there'll be long-term stability. So no one would argue that what we have in place now is sustainable in the long term. We have to get to the completion of phase 1. I am confident we will, within the time frame necessary to make it successful. It's just not today, but hopefully very, very soon. We've made real progress. We made progress as late as yesterday in additional names for this Palestinian organization that's going to be the technocratic organization. So I think we're very close. I think we're going to get there. I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to get through phase 1. And then what I meant about taking years for phase...
Listen to the clinical sociopathy dripping from every word in this clip, because what you just witnessed is the banality of bureaucratic evil, dressed up in khakis and PowerPoint slides, and this is the official stating with the calm assurance of someone ordering lunch that Gaza's reconstruction will take years plural, while donors refuse to commit funds until they know who's in charge, and that their investments won't be blown up again, as if we're discussing a troubled neighborhood gentrification project, rather than more than 70,000 human beings killed, and an entire people systematically reduced to rubble and ash. And wait, because the sheer Orwellian genius of this language is staggering in its cruelty, they need to know who's in charge before they'll rebuild what we've been complicit in destroying. As if the Palestinians haven't been screaming for 75 years, who should be in charge, namely themselves exercising that quaint little concept called self-determination, that is supposedly an inalienable fundamental right, but apparently only when it's convenient for imperial spreadsheet calculations. And you heard the admission that should make your blood curdle. We need to get through phase 1 before phase 2 and phase 3, which will take years, because Gaza has been subjected to what's being described as unprecedented devastation from Israel's brutal genocide, with competing visions and deep political divisions threatening to derail one of the largest post-conflict reconstruction undertakings of the decade. And this official calmly acknowledges they're making progress on names for a technocratic organization, as if shuffling bureaucratic chairs, while more than 14,500 children have been reportedly killed, with many thousands more believed buried under the rubble, represents anything approaching moral legitimacy. The sheer audacity of this imperial management consultant approach to human suffering, where around $70 billion will be needed to reconstruct Gaza with destruction in the region of 84%. And American officials speak about phased approaches and donor conferences and technocratic committees, while famine stalks the living and the dead cry out from beneath collapsed concrete. But here's where it gets absolutely enraging in a way that should mobilize every person who claims to care about justice, because what this clip exposes with crystalline clarity is the fundamental colonial logic that continues to structure American foreign policy in Palestine, the assumption baked into every measured word that Palestinians are objects to be managed rather than subjects with agency, that their political future should be determined by donor conferences in Brussels and Cairo, and American-led boards of peace rather than by Palestinians themselves through free democratic expression. The proposed temporary transitional government is not representative of Palestinians, and even excludes the Palestinian Authority, further violating self-determination and lacking legitimacy, according to UN experts who've been sounding alarms that UN Security Council Resolution 2008-03 runs counter to the Palestinian right to self-determination and consolidates Israel's unlawful presence. Yet here we have American officials calmly discussing years of reconstruction, managed through mechanisms that fundamentally deny Palestinians the right to determine their own fate. The historical echoes should be deafening to anyone paying attention, because this is the same paternalistic imperial logic that justified every colonial project in human history, the civilizing mission repackaged as humanitarian reconstruction, the mandate system rebranded as technocratic governance, and oversight by a board of peace chaired by the U.S. President is not under United Nations authority or transparent multilateral control, while the U.S. is a deeply partisan supporter of Israel and not an honest broker, which UN experts correctly identify as regrettably reminiscent of colonial practices that must be rejected. We're watching in real time the reconstruction of Nakba through bureaucratic PowerPoint, the erasure of Palestinian political will through the language of stability and security and donor confidence, as if the question of who governs Gaza is a technical problem to be solved by international experts, rather than a fundamental question of indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. And let's talk about what's really being said when this official states that donors want to know there's security and long-term stability before they'll pledge billions, because what that's code for is that Palestinian resistance must be completely crushed. that any form of armed struggle against occupation must be eliminated, that Gaza must be pacified and depoliticized and turned into a permanent open-air prison managed by compliant technocrats before international capital will flow. The donors need to know who is going to govern Gaza and what will the security situation be like going forward. Without reassurances, they will not pledge money, according to Arab officials involved in these discussions. And notice how Israeli security concerns are centered and Palestinian liberation is erased, how the entire framework assumes that the problem is Palestinian resistance rather than Israeli occupation, that what needs to change is Palestinian governance structures rather than the fundamental injustice of military occupation and apartheid, and now genocide. The Biden administration's approach here reveals something profoundly disturbing about American liberalism's relationship to empire and human rights, because these are the same officials who speak eloquently about democracy and freedom and human dignity when it serves strategic interests in Ukraine or Hong Kong or Venezuela, but when it comes to Palestine, suddenly we hear this language of pragmatism and complexity and phased approaches and the need to work with existing power structures. Throughout the contentious year inside the State Department, senior leaders repeatedly disregarded their own experts, who were raising alarms about Israeli violations, and Secretary Blinken delivered an ultimatum to Israel demanding they allow hundreds more truckloads of food and medicine into Gaza every day, or else with American law and Biden's own policies prohibiting arms sales to countries that restrict humanitarian aid, Israel had 30 days to comply. But the IDF was accused of roundly defying the U.S. tightening its grip and restricting desperately needed aid. But here's what should absolutely radicalize every progressive and every person under 40 who's watching this unfold, because Biden has faced fierce criticism from younger progressives in the party and from Arab Americans for his handling of the Israel-Hamas war, with more than 100,000 voters in Michigan's Democratic primary choosing uncommitted instead of Biden, and younger voters are more likely to describe Israel's action in Gaza as genocide, with 49% of young voters agreeing with that description, according to polling, which means there's a massive generational divide here, where older Democratic establishment figures continue to operate within a framework of unconditional support for Israel, while younger voters increasingly recognize what they're seeing as ethnic cleansing and genocide. The political establishment is catastrophically out of touch with its own base on this issue, and they're doubling down on policies that are morally bankrupt and strategically disastrous. And notice the complete absence in this official's remarks of any mention of international law, of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, of the countless UN resolutions affirming Palestinian rights, of the basic principle that the International Court of Justice had been crystal clear that conditions cannot be placed on the Palestinian right of self-determination, and the Israeli occupation must end immediately, totally, and unconditionally, with due reparation made to the Palestinians. Instead, we get this technocratic managerialism that treats Gaza's future as a business plan requiring investor confidence rather than a question of fundamental human rights and international law. The plan essentially will leave Palestine in the hands of a puppet administration, assigning the United States, which shares complicity in the genocide, as the new manager of the open-air prison, according to UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who correctly identifies this as an attempt imposed by threat of continued force against a virtually defenseless population. U.S. and Israeli interests, plain and simple. The ceasefire negotiations themselves have been a masterclass in bad faith diplomacy, because Hamas accepted an updated Biden proposal with minor amendments on July 2nd, according to multiple senior Arab and Palestinian officials, with both U.S. and Israeli negotiating teams on board. But Netanyahu issued 4 new non-negotiable conditions that mediators and even Israeli security officials saw as intentionally sabotaging the deal. And yet somehow the narrative in American media continues to be that Hamas is the obstacle to peace. The January ceasefire broke down during Phase 1, with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu refusing to begin negotiations for Phase 2 and adding new conditions, which means we've seen this movie before, where phased approaches become mechanisms for indefinite delay while the killing continues and the suffering multiplies. What this official is describing when they talk about Phase 2 and Phase 3 taking years is essentially a permanent limbo for Palestinians, an indefinite period of international trusteeship where an interim period would be governed by an independent Palestinian technocratic committee, unaffiliated with any political faction, which Hamas accepted in principle to manage public services and oversee reconstruction until the Palestinian Authority completes mandated reforms. But the framework encompasses demilitarization provisions with neither Hamas nor Israel fully committed, which is a recipe for perpetual instability and continued suffering. The entire structure assumes that Palestinian political aspirations can be indefinitely deferred, that reconstruction can happen without addressing the fundamental political questions of sovereignty and self-determination, that you can rebuild homes and hospitals while leaving the structures of occupation and apartheid intact. And here's where we need to connect this to the broader systematic failure of American foreign policy in the Middle East, because a U.S. strategy hoping that Palestinians and other Arabs would be so struck by the awfulness of Hamas's attack that they would be angrier with the group than with Israel is a fantasy, and for such a strategy to have had any chance at all, it would have to offer a credible path toward freedom from 56 years of occupation, but Biden's policy preceding Hamas's attack added significantly to the prevalent Palestinian despair. According to expert analysis, the Biden administration came into office claiming to restore American moral leadership and instead has presided over what a Lancet study estimates as 64,260 people killed between October 7, 2023 and June 30, 2024, though findings underestimate the full impact as they don't account for non-trauma-related deaths resulting from health service disruption, food insecurity, and inadequate water and sanitation, with the Gaza Ministry of Health underreporting mortality by 41%. The language of technocratic governance and donor conferences and phased reconstruction is fundamentally a language of depoliticization, an attempt to transform a political struggle for liberation and self-determination into a technical problem of administration and development. And this is classic colonial logic, where indigenous political demands are reframed as matters of governance capacity and economic development. Palestinian voices have been largely excluded from these discussions, but the rights and democratic decisions of the Palestinian people must be the center of any discussion about Palestinian governance. Yet what we're seeing is exactly the opposite, a process where Palestinians are objects of policy rather than authors of their own political future, where international actors from Washington to Brussels to Cairo negotiate over Palestinian heads about Palestinian futures. And we need to be absolutely clear about what reconstruction under these conditions would actually mean, because according to previous agreements, Israel has full authority to approve or reject reconstruction projects, as well as types and quantities of construction materials, and to approve vendors, suppliers, and contractors. Plus, Israel has the right to approve or deny the list of individuals eligible for housing reconstruction, which means Israeli military occupation would have veto power over every aspect of Palestinian life, even in the reconstruction phase. This isn't rebuilding, it's reconstructing the prison with shinier bars, it's perfecting the mechanisms of control while calling it humanitarian assistance and development aid. The officials' calm assurance that they'll get through Phase 1 and then hopefully eventually to Phase 2 and 3, which will take years, should be recognized for what it is: admission that American policy has no real plan for Palestinian liberation, no genuine commitment to Palestinian self-determination, no intention of challenging the fundamental structures of Israeli domination. The EU is pushing for the committee to be largely drawn from the Palestinian Authority government, led by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who at 90 still holds authoritarian power in tiny pockets of the West Bank, but is increasingly marginalized and weakened by Israel, deeply unpopular among Palestinians and struggling for a say in post-war Gaza, which means the international community is trying to impose a leadership structure that has no popular legitimacy and no democratic mandate. This is the fundamental crisis of liberal Zionism and American exceptionalism colliding in real time, because the Biden administration cannot reconcile its stated commitment to democracy and human rights with its actual policy of unconditional support for Israeli occupation and now genocide. President Biden's administration warned Israel to take greater care to limit harm to civilians in the war in Gaza, but Israel did not heed the admonishments, according to reporting, and yet the weapons keep flowing. The diplomatic cover continues. The UN Security Council vetoes protect Israel from accountability. The entire edifice of American moral authority is crumbling in real time as the world watches Washington enable war crimes while lecturing others about human rights and international law. What progressives understand that the democratic establishment refuses to acknowledge is that there is no technical solution to a fundamentally political problem, no amount of technocratic governance or international oversight or phased reconstruction that can substitute for genuine Palestinian self-determination and liberation from occupation. A Twale approach reveals that a previous colonial order continues to impact the application of international law today, particularly in the way it privileges occupying powers and thwarts Palestinians and other groups from exercising their right to self-determination. And for self-determination to move from potential to practical, states must be willing to carry out the erga omnes nature of self-determination, which means every state has an obligation to respect and ensure Palestinian self-determination, not to participate in its denial through reconstruction schemes that bypass Palestinian political agency. The years this official casually mentions are years of continued suffering, continued displacement, continued denial of basic human dignity and political rights, years in which, according to IPC findings, 1 year into the war, the risk of famine persists across the whole Gaza Strip, with recent surge in hostilities creating growing concerns. This worst-case scenario may materialize as over 1.8 million people across the Strip experience high levels of acute food insecurity, including nearly 133,000 facing catastrophic conditions. These aren't abstract policy challenges, these are human beings, children who will grow up in tents if they survive at all, families separated and traumatized, an entire society systematically destroyed, while American officials discuss phases and frameworks and donor confidence. And here's the revolutionary imperative that should emerge from watching this clip, because what's required is not better technocratic management, or more effective phased approaches, or reformed Palestinian Authority governance structures. What's required is a fundamental challenge to the entire Zionist colonial project, a recognition that there can be no justice in Palestine without dismantling the structures of occupation and apartheid, without centering Palestinian self-determination and liberation as the non-negotiable starting point. Palestinians do not need a surveillance force over the ruins of their destroyed homeland. They need a protective international presence that ends Israel's unlawful occupation, stops the genocide, and restores their capacity for self-governance, including lifting the blockade, ensuring unhindered humanitarian access, supporting Palestinian-led governance, guaranteeing the right of return, and enforcing international law in full. The Biden administration's approach represents the complete bankruptcy of liberal interventionism and humanitarian imperialism, because they've taken the language of human rights and development and reconstruction and weaponized it to serve the interests of occupation and colonialism. This is why younger progressives and Arabs Americans and Muslim Americans and increasingly large swaths of the Democratic coalition are in open revolt against Biden's Gaza policy, because they recognize that what's being presented as pragmatic and realistic and responsible is actually a perpetuation of injustice, a refinement of oppression, a reconstruction of apartheid with international legitimacy. Every donor conference and Brussels meeting and phased reconstruction plan that bypasses Palestinian political agency is an act of colonial violence dressed up as humanitarian concern, and Netanyahu's government has engaged in a last-minute diplomatic push to alter draft resolutions with the language now saying, conditions may be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood after reforms to the Palestinian Authority are faithfully carried out and Gaza redevelopment has advanced, which means Palestinian statehood is being made conditional on Palestinian submission, which is the exact opposite of self-determination. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz wrote that Israel's policy is clear: no Palestinian state will be established, and yet somehow American officials continue to pretend that working within these frameworks will lead to Palestinian freedom. The years this official mentions will be years of perfecting the mechanisms of control, of normalizing permanent occupation under humanitarian guise, of reconstructing Gaza as a permanent charity case rather than liberating Palestine as a sovereign state, and this is completely unacceptable to anyone who takes seriously the principles of self-determination and human rights and international law. What's needed is not patience with phased approaches but mass mobilization, demanding immediate end to occupation, immediate accountability for genocide, immediate recognition of Palestinian sovereignty and statehood, immediate dismantling of apartheid structures, and this means confronting not just Republican enablers of Israeli violence, but democratic enablers who hide behind the language of pragmatism and complexity while facilitating catastrophe. The clip you just watched is evidence that should be used in future tribunals when historians ask how the international community allowed genocide to unfold in plain sight, how American officials could speak with such clinical detachment about reconstruction taking years, while people starve and die under rubble, how the language of humanitarian concern became the vehicle for perpetuating colonial domination. This is the moment of moral clarity, where we recognize that reform is impossible within a framework that denies Palestinian humanity and agency, where we understand that reconstruction without liberation is simply rebuilding the prison, where we commit to solidarity with Palestinian resistance and liberation as the only ethical position in the face of genocide and apartheid and decades of occupation.